war hero, rebel, spy, prison escapee, political lobbyist, prison escapee again, lunatic. All of these words apply to a single man, a man driven by an undying hatred for Britain that would ultimately lead to his final arrest as a leading member of a Nazi spy ring. This is the story of Fritz Duquesne, a man whose slippery tale of bravado and lies touches every continent except Antarctica. Frederick Joubert Duquesne, also known as Fritz, was born in 1877 in a Boer settlement near the Buffalo River. His father, Abraham, was a hunter and trader who roamed all over South Africa, and while his father worked, his great-uncle Jan took care of him. Uncle Jan had also been a hunter, at least until an elephant gun exploded in his face, blowing away his eyes and much of the rest of his face. Aged only 13, Fritz's family sent him to England for schooling. He would stay abroad for years, completing a year of university at Oxford before heading off to military academies in France and Belgium. He bragged of becoming the champion swordsman of Europe, winning international tournaments in multiple disciplines. He also participated in a collection of duels and killed 3 men in the process. But wait, there's no trace of Fritz's attendance in the records at Oxford, St. Cyr, or any other école militaire. But how can that be? Well, the first thing we need to establish in telling this story is that Fritz Duquesne was also a notorious liar. He did go to school in England, but his post-secondary activities are a creation of his own imagination. While his gift of creating facts out of thin air is impressive, it also makes contemporary sources very difficult to take seriously. Whatever happened in Europe, he came home in 1899 as tensions escalated towards the Second Anglo-Boer War. He fought against the British, fighting admirably and earning the nickname the Black Panther of the Veld before being sidelined by a bullet through the right shoulder. Tall tales from the war abound, for example, the Kruger Gold. Now, to keep the Boer treasury from the British, President Kruger supposedly ordered over £1 million of gold bullion from the mine's state treasury to be transferred on the Delagoa Bay Railway to Mozambique, and from there to safety in Europe. One of Fritz Duquesne's many nicknames emerges here: the man who hid the Kruger millions. He supposedly diverted the convoy, possibly while leading it, and hid the gold in a series of caves. To do so, he avoided an assassination attempt by stuffing his sleeping bag and then shooting the would-be assassin as he approached. Supposedly, all the witnesses to him diverting and hiding the gold were killed by hostile natives, which he organized to happen on purpose. Convenient. Fritz also claimed to have destroyed armored British retreats using his self-proclaimed expert knowledge of explosives. He was captured, but while being marched with several others to a prisoner of war camp by a single guard, Fritz grabbed the man's pistol and shot him in the head. He was captured again, but escaped by jumping in the Klip River. It was during his journey from here that he saw the evidence of Lord Kitchener's scorched earth policy, forging his truly burning hatred for Kitchener and the English. Soon, he was captured again, and for the first time, he was successfully thrown in prison, this time by Portuguese colonials, whose territory he was crossing. He tried to escape by climbing into the ceiling and crawling through a ventilation space, but he was ultimately caught again. Sent to Lisbon, Fritz was allowed to walk the grounds of his jail, and began a relationship with his jailer's daughter, until he escaped again. He then joined the British Army as a Boer defector. After all, it was a free trip back to South Africa. He was commissioned as a lieutenant, and off he went, until he promptly defected. Big surprise. He returned home, only to find his family farm destroyed, and heard how his blind uncle had been hanged and his sister and mother raped. His hate for the British had well and truly reached a crescendo. Fritz headed to British Cape Town, once again dressed as a British lieutenant. He planned a doozy of an act of revenge, planting bombs all over the city, at every important point in place. His co-conspirators would deal with others, while he would have the honor of exploding the water pipe leading from Molteno Reservoir on Table Mountain, rising over a kilometer behind the city. Doing so would release 43 million gallons of liquid down onto Cape Town. Sadly for Fritz, his plot was betrayed the night before it was to be carried out, and he was promptly arrested, which wasn't really difficult since he was actively attending a dinner party with the governor that very night. As you might notice, he spends a lot of time just trolling. After a trial where he proudly exclaimed his loyalty to the Boer cause and insulted Kitchener, he was sentenced to be shot the next day, but he was offered a way out. Provide Boer codes, and he would be permitted to live. And he did. Fritz Duquesne gave up the codes. However, He actually created new codes that would mislead the British, giving him precious time to escape before his trick was discovered. At least, that's what he says. Given that they made him decode several letters in front of them, that seems pretty difficult. He was thrown in jail, presumably for the rest of his life, but not if he had anything to say about it. First, Fritz used a spoon to scrape away at the mortar holding the stone wall together. It worked, but too well. He was able to push out some of the stones and wriggle out, but when he was partway through the hole, a large stone fell on his chest, pinning him to the ground. When they found him, the British permanently banished him from South Africa to be imprisoned on the island of Bermuda. He would never return home again. But his story was only just beginning. Already on the ship to Bermuda, Fritz started plotting again. His attempted prisoner of war mutiny on the ship was spoiled, damning him to imprisonment in the worst conditions on board. During a refueling stop in the Azores, he stole a gun and used it to kill a guard, whose body he pushed overboard. Hiding on the ship until he could escape at night, he was caught once again and put in solitary confinement. He could have been sentenced to death, but there wasn't enough proof that he actually killed the guard, since nobody saw it happen. The technicality allowed him to live to fight, or escape, another day. Welcome to the Bermuda military camps, Fritz. Not only are these camps on several small islands in the middle of the archipelago, but traversing between the islands involved avoiding the numerous sharks that populate the waters. Not really an easy place to escape from. Side note, somehow, while on work duty, he managed to meet a woman by the name of Alice Wortley, his future wife, a British denizen of the island. The Boer War ended, but not Fritz's imprisonment. He refused to pledge allegiance to the British crown, and so he couldn't be released. No matter, one day at 5 in the evening, he slipped out his tent, through the fence, swam 1.5 miles through the shark-infested waters, all while dodging the patrol boats. He made it to the port of Hamilton, where he found a temporary job. Pimp. Working with a nice lady by the name of Vera, Fritz only had to work this job for about a week before he got his chance. He got a sailor drunk and then stole the man's clothes while he was, busy with his prostitute. He was thrown in the brig to sober up by the first mate, who thought he was just another drunk sailor coming back to the boat. By the time his disguise was discovered, the ship was already well on its way to Baltimore. Fritz was a stowaway. However, he managed to talk his way into working on the ship to pay for his passage. But his real concern was that the captain would turn him over to the immigration authorities when they landed. As such, he planned another escape. He jumped ship in Chesapeake Bay, swimming safely to shore, no sharks this time, and setting foot in America for the first time. But once again, the question becomes, is Fritz exaggerating the story a bit? After all, his official papers say that he arrived on that ship, the Margaret. But then again, it would be, a bit stupid to explain everything that happened to the immigration authorities. Once in America, he traveled to New Jersey to meet with some Boer sympathizers. While staying there, he reunited with Alice, whose parents had moved to America. But it was time for Fritz to move again, off to New York City, aiming to become a newspaper reporter. He rose quickly through the ranks, aided by a developing backstory. According to himself, he reported at the siege of Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War. He also reported from Macedonia and Tangier. What else? Traveling the Congo on behalf of King Leopold of Belgium, where he supposedly captured a gorilla, leading an expedition in Australia, and building theaters in the West Indies. In reality, Fritz spent all this time in New York, where he was developing a new persona. He adopted a British accent and began to publish novels and plays. And despite all his lies, he did actually have a good reputation as a big game hunter from Africa, which did have some validity. It was in connection to this that he was contacted by President Teddy Roosevelt. The president was planning a major hunting expedition to Africa at the end of his presidency. Meanwhile, Duquesne was publishing articles about what Roosevelt might encounter during his time in Africa, sharing his tales of African game with readers. As a result, Fritz was on his way to the White House to meet with Teddy. Duquesne relished the meeting, but was quick to turn on the president after he left on his trip. While Roosevelt was in Africa, Fritz wrote negative articles about him, even speculating if he would survive. Money always took precedence. He even suggested that Roosevelt and his companions should be prevented from re-entering the country without examination, since they could carry deadly African diseases back into America. Of course, he said all this while claiming that Roosevelt had asked him to lead the entire expedition, only to change his mind after discovering that British officials in Africa hated and were scared of the incredible Fritz Duquesne. He also made fun of the nickname supposedly given to Roosevelt by locals, Bwana Tumbo, meaning Sir with a Big Belly, or as Fritz translated it, Mr. Unusually Large Stomach. It was at this time that Fritz got mixed up in politics, though not with anything boring. He became a major champion of the American Hippo Bill. The bill originated with a man by the name of Frederick Burnham, who also happened to be an old enemy of Duquesne. Burnham had been a scout with the British during the Boer War, and Duquesne had been assigned specifically to kill him. Burnham's statement about Duquesne is quite funny. Much has been written about I should change my voice. Much has been written about Duquesne, most of it rubbish. Clearly he recognizes that Fritz is a bit of a liar. Yet his real accomplishments were so terrible and amazing that they make the yellow journal thrillers about him seem as mild as radio bedtime stories. Each of us had been given special orders by our respective governments to kill or capture the other. But with this great project in view, the two could work together. The Hippo Bill aimed to address a potential meat shortage in America by introducing African animals to similar environments in the USA. The bill would eventually fail, but Duquesne had a new venture to pursue. He took to the hippopotamus idea and built on it, eccentrically. In the spring of 1911, he organized banquets serving imported meats and explored bringing elephants to Central and South America and selling them as beasts of burden. At the same time, he sought funding for a trip to South America where he planned to film a documentary. He had received some help from an odd company, Goodyear Tire, who were paying him to find and bring back natural rubber from the region. Rubber didn't exist in the region he was going to, but that wouldn't be enough to stop him from accepting the money. He also got funding from a film company, which he used to buy 20,000 feet of film for a total price of $80,000, which I think that's like $2.5 million today. On this, he took out extensive insurance policies, protecting it from just about everything. That is foreshadowing, by the way. Before he left on this expedition, though, he became an American citizen. Fritz arrived in Manaus, Brazil, as the Great War began. His deep hatred for England from the Boer War persisted, and he saw an opportunity to do some damage on behalf of Germany. He got hired by the German Navy to do exactly that. He finally got to bring out some of his favorite tricks, besides, lying about everything. Aliases. Although, actually, that is kind of still lying about everything. In his place was the play actor Frederick Fredericks, or George Fordham, a middle-aged Dutch botanist with poor posture. He then traveled around Central and South America, making his way into port cities and wreaking havoc. Fritz claimed to have sunk 22 British ships and set at least 100 on fire. His strategy was simple. He would ship orchid bulbs, mineral specimens, rare plants, or film aboard British ships, which would then inexplicably blow up. He would bribe a drunk sailor to bring them aboard, claiming that they were just for a friend at the next port. He also recounted stories about diving into the harbor with oil drums filled with TNT and attaching them to the bottom of ships. Although these stories are, like much of his personal stories, I'll say, dubious in their authenticity. Fritz became a well-known figure in Rio during this period under the name Piet Niakoud, which, please note, is Duquesne, written phonetically, pronounced backwards. Piet was known for constantly denouncing the Germans, which helped him earn the favor of the British in the city. Classic prank. His greatest triumph was the sinking of the Tennyson. Fritz, or technically George Fordham, sent back his crates of film on the ship. Oh, and by film I mean a little bit of film and a lot bit of bombs. The explosion killed multiple sailors, although the ship made it to beach just in time, barely avoiding the depths. But a co-conspirator ratted out Fritz, leading to his exposure, and the exposure of Fordham and the British-loving Piet Niakoud. A British warrant called for his arrest, and the death sentence. But Fritz was already dead, killed by natives in Bolivia. His last letter to a friend complained of his misfortune of having his last couple of years of film work destroyed by the Germans sinking the Tennyson. Well, that's all for me. Never mind. He was found alive. 12 days after faking his death, he put out a story about being found alive. Maybe he just didn't like being dead. Regardless, Fritz Duquesne was back on the move. With the help of a German submarine, he arrived back in Baltimore in 1916. But he's probably lying about that since there's no evidence of this extremely unlikely scenario taking place. I have never researched a more confusing person, but he actually returned to New York, and I can't tell you how he got there, but it was most likely not by submarine. Once there, he cooked up a scheme to acquire some funds. As Frederick Fredericks, he bought $24,000 worth of films and proceeded to insure them for $33,000. He stored them at a warehouse, which would mysteriously burn down. He then tried to make his claim, also demanding, as George Fordham, the $80,000 he was owed for the insured films that went down with the Tennyson. Obviously, the insurance company was suspicious, but they didn't have any avenue to prove that Fordham and Fredericks were actually the same person, Fritz Duquesne. Proving was especially hard now since his wife, Alice, was handling the claims for him. Meanwhile, Fritz claims to have been plotting the death of his hated foe, Lord Kitchener. This is probably the most incredible of Fritz's stories, and one that he, almost certainly made up. Indeed, his 1932 biography is titled The Man Who Killed Kitchener. Apparently, Duquesne replaced the kidnapped Russian nobleman Boris Zakrevsky, who was to accompany Kitchener on a voyage to Petrograd. From the HMS Hampshire, Fritz signaled a German submarine, which sank the ship. Fritz then jumped overboard and swam to the sub, where he was pulled aboard. Back in Germany, he was given the highest of honors, the title of Baron of Brandenburg, the Iron Cross with gold leaves. Wow. But there's not much evidence beyond his own words of all of this happening. The accepted cause of sinking is the ship striking a German mine that had been laid approximately a week before. What Fritz was actually doing in this period is unknown, but he did turn up in Washington, D.C. after this, looking for work. He then traveled back to New York City, looking once again to become a public figure. And so, the war hero Captain Claude Stoughton was born. On his chest sat numerous medals, including the Military Cross and the Croix de Guerre. On his face sat a fancy waxed-up mustache. His regiment, the West Australian Light Horse. He claimed to have been gassed 4 times and bayoneted another 3. He told of the Somme and the ill-fated attack on the Straits of Gallipoli. He even met British officials, all none the wiser that the West Australian Light Horse wasn't even a real regiment. Captain Stoughton raised money for victory bonds and the Red Cross. In this way, he was actually helping the British, but I guess the blood feud could be delayed in exchange for some fame. But not indefinitely. Caught saying some anti-Italian things, not to mention his very German-looking mustache, an investigation on the captain deepened. A search of his apartment found numerous clippings and pictures that revealed his backstory. Perhaps keeping an invoice of the film shipment on the Tennyson with clippings describing its explosion was a bad idea, especially with the letters of endorsement from German officials. Fritz was arrested and charged with insurance fraud with a $50,000 bail, which is something ridiculous like $800,000 today. Because of the Tennyson incident, he also faced extradition to England and the firing squad. It seemed that Fritz Duquesne was finally caught, stuck in a prison that he couldn't escape from, and he degenerated into a state of insanity. Law enforcement was unconvinced, and he was brought before a lunacy commission, which is fair enough given his reputation. He appeared at the commission's hearing, ranting and unhinged, shouting orders at the doctors who'd come to testify as though he were commanding them in battle. For 2 straight days, he babbled constantly. And then, utter silence. He refused to leave his cell for hearings or even utter a word. And ultimately, he was committed to Matawan State Hospital for the insane. The investigators were right, though. He was completely fine. Unfortunately for Fritz, the other patients at the hospital were very much insane, and they started to actually drive him crazy. Not literally. He claimed to have gotten better after 5 months and was sent back for trial. But there was still time for more hijinks. In the courtroom, he collapsed. Doctors declared him paralyzed. He was tested. They needled his legs, looking for any reaction. Nothing. Fritz Duquesne was wheelchair-bound for the hospital. Over the following months, he lost weight. He looked increasingly aged, and he spent his days looking out the window, just feeding the birds. He slept with a blanket over his head, claiming it was to hide from rats and insects. And, during his twice-daily bathroom breaks, he secretly massaged his legs and did exercises, so he'd still be able to use them. It was all just another trick, another escape being planned. Fritz never cared about birds. What he did care about was sawing the bars on the window all day, every single day. The day before his planned extradition, he broke out. Dropping out the second-story window, scaling a wall and fence, Fritz Duquesne was free. But only for a few minutes. His atrophied legs struggled beneath him, and he was picked up by a police officer who thought he was drunk. However, Fritz talked him out of taking him to jail, or back to the same hospital he escaped from, and made his break. He took some time at a boarding house to regain use of his legs, then left the area, eventually settling in Boston. Of course, the NYPD never forgot Fritz's escape, mostly because for the next decade, he had friends send them telegrams and postcards signed by him, inviting them to come and find him. In Boston, Duquesne worked in advertising, and then for a movie studio, which ended up relocating him back to New York City. He began working for Quigley Publishing Company under the name Major Frank Craven, wearing a monocle, of course. It was here, in the early 1930s, that he was finally recaptured. He was ambushed by police in the lobby of the Quigley building, taken into custody. In his office, they found a copy of The Man Who Killed Kitchener, his biography. His claim was that he was simply trying to acquire the film rights for it, but they didn't believe him. But for once, the law was on Fritz's side. Famed lawyer Arthur Garfield Hayes successfully defended him in court, and he was declared a free man. Unfortunately, he was then promptly arrested on the charge of having escaped prison, itself an illegal act. But Hayes successfully defended him on this charge as well, all for the fee of $0. At this point, Fritz's main method of subsistence was sweet-talking women and then freeloading off them. However, he would begin to do intelligence work for some American pro-Nazi organizations. Remember, pro-Nazi is anti-British, his favorite. This would obviously get him into problems both then and in the future. His mistress at the time was Jewish and secretly reported on his activities to interested reporters. He also had a falling out with Hayes because the wonderful lawyer was also Jewish. By the late 1930s, Fritz Duquesne was now going by Colonel Fritz Duquesne. Meanwhile, German intelligence was looking at building an espionage network in America. Colonel Niklaus Ritter, in charge of setting up this network, was an old friend of Duquesne. Somehow, anyway. He recruited Fritz, who was predictably happy to work against England. However, the middleman agent William Siebold defected to the FBI. The FBI began to tail the others who were involved, including the man they called the Duke, Duquesne. Despite being in his late 50s by this point, he continued to be a pain for the law to keep track of. He always just assumed he was being followed and acted accordingly. Still, at least once they figured out where he lived, the net was closing in. The FBI rented the apartment above him and planted a microphone to listen to his conversations. The agent inhabiting the apartment befriended Fritz, who delighted in telling the stories of his past, prison escapes and other crimes, basically. Once, when he was away, they entered his apartment, searching it for evidence, and temporarily losing his cat, which almost blew the entire operation. The FBI was shocked at the authenticity and quality of the information that Duquesne was collecting. After a meeting between Siebold and Duquesne in an office that featured a two-way mirror, the FBI decided to round up Fritz and the other spies involved. Why? Well, the Black Panther of the Veld was planning to start blowing things up again. Arrests were made. It was the largest group of espionage charges in American history. 33 spies were arrested, 18 directly tied to Ritter. Fritz wouldn't be given much chance of escape. 8 officers surrounded him whenever the lights were turned down to show film evidence. When he took the stand, he continued with his traditional suave half-truths and, well, full-out lies. He accused the FBI of setting him up, dragging him out of his home naked. He insisted on asking questions back instead of testifying. He admitted to frequently lying. Anything that could feasibly help him weasel out of charges, he tried. And then the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy declaring war on the United States. Basically, Fritz was screwed. Sentenced to 18 years and a secondary 2-year sentence, he was off to prison. Forever dramatic, he yelled, "Long live America!" as he exited the courthouse. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called the events the greatest spy roundup in U.S. history. Over the next 13 years in prison, Fritz would insist on his innocence. He displayed mental deterioration, but the administration was understandably doubtful if it was faked or not. Multiple times he was caught with contraband, specifically letters pleading his innocence and razor blades. In 1951, he also sued 20th Century Fox, whose financial influence he claimed was keeping him locked up. Why? Because they made a movie about the spy roundup called The House on 92nd Street. The lawsuit failed. He tried to sue the FBI for taking his property, which of course included $3 million in diamonds, which also failed. Broke and tired, he was finally released from prison in 1954 at age 77. He was put in a nursing home and remained under supervision from a parole officer. He died the next year of a stroke, age 78. To this day, the name Fritz Duquesne remains in the FBI's Notorious Offenders file. He deployed a ridiculous amount of aliases during his lifetime. I don't know if I should read these all out, but I think my personal favorite is Fred Duquesne. Perhaps he was best summed up by his sister-in-law, Mildred. You couldn't believe anything Fritz said, but he said it all so perfectly, you thought it was all true. Thanks for watching my video about Fritz, my longest ever video. He was an exceedingly complicated person, but very interesting to research, although it probably would have been easier if he would just stop lying so much. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel and like the video to help out with the algorithm, and I'll see you soon with another one. Thank you.